All right, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you happen to be in the world and whatever time of day it happens to be. Thanks for signing in and joining us for Flowsom's State of Salesforce DevOps 2024 webinar. We've got a panel of really strong experts and folks with us today. We're going to be taking you through some interesting things that we've learned over the past few months of surveying our customers, others in the DevOps community, and others. Let's do a little bit of housekeeping. First and foremost, our webinar is being recorded. We will be sending out the recording afterwards. We know that folks may have questions or thoughts. There's a Q&A button in Zoom here where you can post your questions and ask it. And we have a very capable set of folks who are going to monitor those questions. We may or may not have time to get to them live, but we will answer them in line. And if you want us to, we will follow up. And if you happen to stay to the end, you'll be entered into a drawing with a chance to win one of three $50 Amazon gift cards. So stick around, hang out with us, and spend the next 30 minutes or so talking about the state of Salesforce DevOps. By the way, we do have a report that we've produced from our findings, and we will be sending this to you automatically via email after the end of the webinar at some point in the next few days. So stay tuned in your inbox for that report. But let's talk about what we're going to go over today. Here's our quick agenda. It comes in four parts. We're going to have some introductions to us, to Flowsom, and to our market and who we cover. We're going to talk about the survey that we run periodically for the larger Salesforce DevOps customer base out there. We're going to spend the vast majority of time talking with our panel about key insights and conclusions. And at the end, we have a few thoughts for you to take away, steps you can take to maybe improve your Salesforce DevOps, and we'll go from there. But let's actually start by introducing ourselves. My name is Joe. I lead our solution engineering contingent here at Flowsom. I've been in the Salesforce ecosystem about 14 and a half years. I'm privileged to be joined by Don. Don, do you want to take a moment and introduce yourself?
Yeah, thanks, Joe. Don Bloomquist here. I'm on the customer success side of the Folsom organization. I've had various leadership roles within the customer success side over the past 5 years, and probably more importantly to the audience here, worked with the majority of our customer base. So I'm into the hundreds of customers I've either helped implement, follow up, reviewed processes, etc.
Thank you, Don. And Don has saved my bacon quite a few times when it comes to DevOps. So we're really privileged to have your perspective here, Don. We appreciate that. Let's introduce Flowsom. For those of you who have not run into us before, have not worked with us before, Flowsom is a company focused 100% on your success with your Salesforce practice. We were started well over a decade ago by a former Salesforce employee, and our flagship product is our DevOps tool, where we help you safely and quickly and consistently move changes between your environments and build quality things on the Salesforce platform. But in the time we've been around, we found need to expand into other tools, data migration, data backup and recovery for Salesforce, as well as Salesforce security posture and monitoring with our Trust Center product. So we do quite a few things. We also have customers across a lot of different industries of various sizes and various maturity levels in their DevOps practice. And as Don, you mentioned, you've worked with a lot of our customer base and seen kind of from soup to nuts what these companies are doing from DevOps. So it should probably come as no surprise that we do survey not just our customer base, but the larger Salesforce DevOps community out there, because DevOps for Salesforce has become a very, very important thing. And we found some interesting things in our most recent survey. We get a lot of respondents coming from IT and banking and media and other industries, but really our survey, our periodic survey, is focused on a few things. Questions around your Salesforce development practice, your business challenge and benefits from Salesforce development. We all know that customizing Salesforce is the norm and that there's ROI to it, but the real question is how fast and safely can you do it? We ask feature-specific questions around version control, development, DevOps automations, integrations, and other pieces, as well as how people are backing up data and a few other things. That's where we started to come into some very interesting responses. So we wanted to spend some time with you sharing some key insights from that survey. Don and I will kick these ideas back and forth, and hopefully we can get some direction and action that all of you can take on some of these things. And I think if we had to call an overall theme for what we read in these results, it's that Salesforce is still the art of living dangerously. We'll see why in just a minute. But at the end of the day, a lot of customers buy Salesforce on the promise that it's very easy to customize and to make their own. But the reality of that matter can really weigh on you after you've bought and implemented. That's why we end up having a lot of conversations with customers and of Salesforce and prospects for us. DevOps is super important. So let's talk about some of the things that we found as a result of the survey. First things first, we're asking people where you're building things and how you're moving things to production. We certainly saw a wide variety of methods and tools in use for moving Salesforce changes around. Salesforce launched an orthodoxy years ago that you must develop in a sandbox, but we find that 27% of the respondents in this survey are still working directly in production. Now, that might either be partially working in production or fully working in production, but it seems to me, Don, that when I started years ago at Salesforce, the whole idea was you'd buy it departmentally and assign a full-time admin, and he'd work in production. And I think that's still alive and well. Does this scare you?
Uh, to a certain extent, it does. Yes, Joe. I mean, I shouldn't say to a certain extent, it doesn't surprise me. Does it scare me? A little bit, yeah. I mean, I think a lot of us have grown up in a traditional application development environment where things had to be done a certain way, where everything had to work together, and you followed certain processes. Along comes Salesforce, as you said, and especially initially it was quite easy to purchase, and now Salesforce introduces this new paradigm. Hey, you don't need to have when you want to make a change, you don't need to deploy every single thing you have in your environment. You have the opportunity to only change 10 of those items or files or components as you might call them. And you can do that directly in and make one change to one file and see that business result that you want. So the result of that is I think a lot of people went, that's great. We saw people start to work more in silos because they could just go make a change and not worry about it, not worry about impacts elsewhere. People taking advantage of the ease of working in that sales platform and how quickly they can make those changes. So a lot of power, they can turn things around very quickly. But the result of that, I think we've seen, and I think we've really seen it grow and proliferate over the years, is now what happens when we're making changes directly in those environments, especially production. What happens now when we start to have manual errors or we make a mistake? The wild, wild west type theme kind of starts to creep in here. So as customers have gone through that, I think that proliferated a little bit. I think customers started to realize that, hey, Salesforce is really a mission critical system. And a mission critical system has requirements around things like auditing and compliance and consistency, ensuring no errors or making sure your error rate drops so that you're not impacting your business. So that side of the fence, while the ease of use has come in, those what scares me is all of those requirements around that consistency, around that compliance, around that auditing, so that customers can have something that they can fully trust that their business is not going to be damaged by a mistake or the wild, wild west, as we call it.
Yeah, so to kind of sum up, Don, I think at the end of the day, you will find situations where you have to work inside a Salesforce environment. But DevOps is a culture and a practice and a philosophy. And so while we can roll with the punches with that, that's not our ideal state, but a platform like Salesforce makes you think about those things, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
and I think that kind of plays into the next thing that we found. There's risk out there, and people are experiencing symptoms of that risk. This was pretty profound. 68% of respondents said that their environments, their sandboxes and prod and other pieces are out of sync with each other. Almost the same number said they struggle with merging things and conflicts during merge. That could mean people doing parallel development work. It could mean other pieces. But we think these two things are related and that they identify some key risk to Salesforce customers, right?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I do agree with you. I do think there is a relationship here. So we're talking about a very dynamic environment like Salesforce. I think environments being out of sync, there could be a various reasons for that. It's not necessarily always a bad thing. It's going to happen when you have such a dynamic environment. But now, how do we manage those? Those out of sync could mean between orgs. It could mean between your version control system and an org. And it's really how we manage that that syncing in those environments that's going to enable you to succeed. So, I mean, in an ideal world, everybody starts to change on an environment that mimics production. I mean, that ideal world, you're going to minimize the number of conflicts you end up with as you move through deploying. If I start with what's in production, I theoretically at the end, my conflicts or my differences are going to be just what I worked on. That's not always possible, and in some cases, actually, it may even hinder things like parallel development. So Joe and I might want to work on the same change in parallel at the same time. We don't want to have to worry about stepping on one another's toes or slowing one another down. So we want to be able to build out our change as quickly as we can, and then handle that at the appropriate time and place later in or at some point in my release cycle. And at that point, we can then handle what are the conflicts, not only just between what the change we're making, but what are the conflicts that Joe and I had. So they're not a bad thing. We have that parallel development. I think the key to these and the key where we have out of sync that can cause some conflicts, we have some customers that are challenging and struggling with merge conflict. It's easy identification, I think, is the key here, Joe. So if we have easy identification of those conflicts, something that developers can trust, then I think that process becomes easier and less unwieldy to those that have to manage those.
Yeah, and Don, it kind of occurs to me that with Salesforce, you, especially as a declarative developer, you get a sense of omniscience and omnipotence, right? But when you have
Absolutely.
to start working with other people, that can change a little bit. People who are pro coders are probably used to merging changes and
Sure,
resolving
absolutely.
those conflicts. How intuitive do you think it is for those traditional low code developers that Salesforce embraces to do that process?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I think how intuitive is it? I think it's not necessarily ingrained in their behaviors like it might be with a more of a pro code, a person that's been developing in traditional programming. So I don't think it is immediately intuitive. So I think you need a UI that really helps and makes sense to that user, a UI where that identification is easy, where you're not getting what we like to call false positives, where some of that code might be a conflict that might not just due to the ordering of some of those blocks or some of those fields, et cetera, that you might have in your change. So I think it's not necessarily intuitive. So the UI, I think, needs to help make that intuitive so that does become that for those low code
Yeah, that's
developers.
a critical point, I think, Don, because at the end of the day, what we're trying to do here is speed up development, increase the quality, reduce your failure rate, reduce the number of things you have to roll back. And when you have a process that a lot of Salesforce developers unaccustomed to with merging, then anything you can do to make that easier and more Salesforce specific is going to be a lot better. Which I think kind of brings us to our next observation is that Salesforce, after they told people to start using sandboxes, they also started telling people to use version control, specifically Git version control, to hold their metadata. Now, different Salesforce developers have been doing this at different places for years. You might get your Apex class or your Lightning Web Component or Gasp your old Aura component and put it in version control. That's natural. But all Salesforce metadata kind of belongs in version control to have a source of truth. When Salesforce moved from the sort of org based development model to the package based or version control based development model, they forced this orthodoxy on people. But I think, Don, what we've seen is that when you ask a Salesforce declarative developer to check something into Git, that's another brick wall, a counterintuitive process, right? And it's a very, very different paradigm for many folks. And the process of doing that merge can be very labor intensive and slow people down, can't it?
Yeah, I absolutely I think it can. I mean, if we talk about Git and where Git grew up, Git's been around for 20, 25 years, and pro coders, traditional application developers, they kind of grew up with it. That's how they did business. So they're used to it. They know what to expect to see. They know their 20 Git commands that they just need to run on a within their editor, almost command line type approach. And so for them, no problem. For those that don't have that, and let's think really hard about probably the majority of changes. I'm not saying even probably. We know the majority of changes coming through within Salesforce are more declarative type changes. So how it gets a little difficult to expect admins or citizen developers that don't really have that true application development background to get and understand, oh, a Git command and what I need to run and branches and the theory of them and where do I take things off, etc. I think it needs to get a little bit simplified for those so that ultimately all personas, whether you're a pro code heavy or low code heavy developer, and all assets ultimately, whether they're programmatic, so Apex classes, et cetera, or those declarative type components that we have within Salesforce. Version control should ensure that all those are done harmoniously. So all of our changes are able to be managed within the system and move harmoniously. And everybody involved in that change can actually participate and participate on equal footing, on equal and have confidence in that footing.
So net, nothing wrong with doing version control, but the tools that are out there may not be ideal for the Salesforce world. And the practices around those tools in the Salesforce world are going to be a little bit different than what you see in the high code platform world, right? Obviously, with a goal towards redundancy and productivity and auditability, right? Now, I guess the implications of that were pretty well on display in our survey results. So we asked people what kind of ROI they're getting out of adopting DevOps for Salesforce. So we kind of exclude that 27% who are still working in production and go towards the folks who are doing various approaches for DevOps, either a Salesforce specific tool or duct tape and baling wire DevOps with a highly scripted platform. And I think we saw something profound here. We expect a heck of a lot of ROI. We expect a good return on productivity, faster releases, shorter time to revenue, all of those great statistics. But not everybody's realizing that. I mean, the bottom statistic really stands out at me. Uh, People don't know how much they're getting from it.
No.
And do you suppose that's because they're not able to measure it?
I think there's a couple of factors. I think the measuring definitely is one of those key aspects, Joe. And quite frankly, across the application development base, but across Salesforce changes and Salesforce DevOps groups, metrics and measuring is probably not done at the rate it needs to be. So lots of companies aren't really sure what to measure, and so again, they proceed, they make their changes, but they're not able to define the metrics that they're looking for. They're not measuring those, so they don't know whether they're getting the real benefit or not. And I think that also applies into those that are saying, "Hey, our ROI is less than this." They don't truly have that measurement in their background to justify that one way or the other. And I think that's really important. I mean, ultimately, one of the things that we like to espouse upon is definitely measure, measure, measure. Where you're not sure, measure. It gives you the opportunity to jump in and make those adjustments where need be. I mean, if we start talking ROI, are we comparing efficiency from just one deployment, one change? It gets pretty hard to have a metric and gain an ROI specifically on that. We have to step back, look at the entire process, the metrics of the entire suite of work we're working on, not just that one change. So how are we reducing or eliminating conflicts or impacts on production when a bad behavior might happen, our ability to recover, our ability for multiple people to work in parallel without stepping on each other's toes, et cetera. So overall, we definitely have to bring metrics into the picture and strongly consider them if we truly want to adopt DevOps as a practice.
Yeah, so what I'm hearing from you is number one, you do need to measure, but ideally you want to measure something intrinsically. You don't want to force the measurement. But number two, as you mentioned, you've got to measure it over a good period of time to get a meaningful statistic. And DevOps being a process and a philosophy and a mindset really requires that approach over time. And if you want to twiddle your bits and change your approach, it requires a bit of longevity in terms of observation. It strikes me though that people are getting ROI from this. So, less than 10K a month is probably not a horrible ROI. People are getting something out of it. But in your experience, I mean, how many organizations really truly optimize this? I imagine you've worked with a few.
Yeah, in terms of how many, probably less percent than we want, but those that are really focused on that, I think it does help, and we do have a number of customers we see that do measure that. They do come back on a quarterly basis, a semi-annual basis, have a look at, hey, what's working, what's not, where are bottlenecks, et cetera. And those they're able to tune, make adjustments, and kind of take a high performance engine, so to speak, and tweak it and make it to make sure the combustion rates, et cetera, are all proper and they can go at the speed they need to go at.
Yeah, you definitely have to refine the race car for different races, and so
For sure.
that makes
For sure.
absolute sense to me. Now, interesting other observation here who we have for the final thing that we want to review. I think the right way to look at this slide is inverted because we asked people in the Salesforce ecosystem, what challenges did you expect to solve but are not able to achieve by adopting Salesforce DevOps? So, in other words, you went after DevOps, you were hoping to get this, and you didn't quite get it. And so,
Right.
the good news is that, what's 100 minus 37? A good number of folks are getting improved software quality. More eyes on it probably means that. But what really strikes me is that more than half of people who adopt DevOps aren't getting faster deployments. More than half aren't getting cost reduction. More than half aren't increasing the efficiency of Salesforce development. What do you attribute that to?
I think when we start talking that, I think it's still step back and look at big picture. I mean, the efficiency in a change, it can be a little bit difficult to justify. I think some of that often comes in, hey, it's been quicker for me just to run this change set than it was for me to take this through a DevOps deployment and push it. And so we can't just expect to be able to move faster than clicking the button and deploying something with a change set, as an example, or doing something directly in production. That's very difficult to overcome. But let's think about that process across multiple environments, the consistency across multiple environments. How are we able to make changes in parallel? Are we able to eliminate errors and prevent a bunch of that rework and panic work that really disrupts your development cycle and forces you into a recovery mode? And we know those recovery modes always take up a significant amount of time. So I think big picture and understanding that it's not just one change, it's not just a deployment that we're talking efficiency. We've got to step back and look at the whole picture and the metrics across that.
So the path of least resistance is often the first obstacle, what you're saying. People go back to what they know because they perceive it quick to be quicker. But the goal here isn't necessarily quicker in that individual moment. The goal is increased quality, increased auditability, fewer conflicts, and the ROI shows itself in aggregate over time as opposed to in a
Yes.
moment. Do you feel like there's an approach aspect of that here too? If somebody stands up Git and Jenkins and then has to hire a bunch of scripting folks who really know Git and Jenkins or some of the tool, do you feel like there's a learning curve on the individual approach that you're taking in terms of technology?
Yeah, certainly there can be, depending upon the approach you take. Absolutely, there's a certain ramp up and there's a certain cost just to maintain that as well. Um, when we're talking ramp ups, they may have that internally, they may not. But when we're typically ramping up, we're automatically causing ramp up or exclusion of other groups. And so that starts to become a challenge. So again, I think you want to push that back to a tool where everybody can use to minimize that ramp up, minimize that cost to maintain and that ramp up for the people. You want people to be able to come into your tool and your system and right away be able to use it because it's intuitive. It's Salesforce. It's a UI that's familiar to you. So that you can save some of your time, save some of your efforts on the maintenance and the ramp up or onboarding of those team members.
Yeah, and I imagine taking advantage of automation can help with a lot of that as well. Whatever DevOps approach you're taking, other than change sets because they're not automatable, you probably want to invest in that automation because then you might get faster deployments and improved quality to ensure consistency.
Yes.
Well, that's excellent, Don. I think we all live this. I think we all know that DevOps is a journey, not a step that you take, that it's a change in mindset and that its benefits are long lived. Now, let's start talking through some steps that our customers, our prospects, folks who we work with can take, really anybody in the Salesforce ecosystem can take to improve these things and make sure they're getting ROI out of this. We like to think of Salesforce DevOps in terms of a maturity model. This is something that we put out at Trailblazer DX last year and that we've been refining, and we try to rate our customers on kind of this scale. It's not a hard and fast scale, but these are attributes of companies that are at various stages of DevOps maturity. You on the left, you might be coming right off of change sets and learning to do things a little bit better. The very right, you might be incorporating security and automation and quality tools into your DevOps process and getting the most ROI. I imagine that the ROI is going to be pretty highly correlated with where you are on this chart and how well you're executing each step.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there certainly is a relationship there. The more mature you are, the more consistent you are with your steps. You're probably measuring, tracking the key metrics for you so that you can fine tune and make those adjustments to drive that efficiency or drive down an error rate or a change failure rate if you have that as an example. So less mature typically measure less. It's typically we're going out and blasting things on an individual basis as quick as we can. More mature, we're doing things in that consistent pattern and that proven pattern, and using those automations, using those software best practices to achieve those results.
Yeah. And by the way, if you wanted to figure out where you lie on this maturity curve, we've got a few provocative questions that you're welcome to take in this survey. So feel free to grab that link or take a picture of that QR code. The tool won't give you an assessment at the end, but it'll at least prompt you to think. And we like to collect statistics on how our customers kind of rate themselves. So give that some thought and go through that survey. Tell us what you think, and hopefully we can have some more conversations about it as time goes on. But this maturity model really does help us when we run into a new customer where, Don, your team is implementing Flowsum. We kind of assess where you sit on this maturity curve, and we decide where we can improve to move you to the right and to deepen those tools that you have. Now, we probably want to take care of some logistics here as well. This report is going to be sent out to you. We just reviewed some quick statistics from it, but there's a lot more under there. So watch your inbox for that. And ultimately, I think we have some folks asking questions in the Q&A panel. And I think you're welcome to contact us if you want to talk more about DevOps maturity, about where people see ROI, about where your individual organization can see some ROI. But I'm starting to see some interesting questions in the chat, Don. You know, ultimately, what I'm getting one that's really interesting. We talked a lot about measuring ROI, but someone was wondering which key statistics are out there for ROI? Which are the common ones that you see that everybody thinks about first?
Yeah, good question. So I think there's two or three really key ones. One overall, and I think this is still the most important ROI question to you when you're looking at efficiency, is your overall velocity. What is that change in which you're able to move changes through? Not just how long does it take me to do a deployment, but my overall velocity. So how long does it? What is my rate at which I can make business change? I think that's still the prevalent, that's still the important throughput one. Other items we see a lot of change failure rates. So I think, how many times do you deployment? How many times do you have to roll that back or revert it or update that change right after you've made it? So that change failure rate is a big one because that costs companies time. It costs companies efforts and such in there. And then number three, I think it's still how long does it take you from when a requirement comes in to when that requirement is actually sitting in production and being used by your business or your end users. Does it take
So
me 3 days?
traditional
Does
DORA
it take me
metrics, yeah,
3 months?
yeah, traditional DevOps reporting metrics for sure.
Traditional DevOps, yeah.
And does anything get into kind of the size of a change? I mean, I know there can be a lot of variability there.
Yeah, I think in terms of size, uh, the one piece that really does come into size, I think, is testing. And in terms of when we have a bigger change, typically testing takes a longer period of time, and we have to expect that. Typically, a bigger change often results in, there can be more unknowns. We have to do more exploration. We might have additional integrations that tend to start to come into play. So we have to go out and test those integrations. So testing is truly the piece that comes into when we're dealing with bigger changes. So we would always encourage promote smaller changes, release more rapidly where possible. Not always possible on a certain scale of change, but it's a good practice to promote those smaller changes, release more rapidly, keep that testing in the cycle as early as possible to help drive that efficiency and prevent that long cycle of testing and holy smokes, do we have this right?
And it occurs to me that what we talked about earlier, when people struggling with merge conflicts, that becomes more important at that point to get that process down, right? Because if you have 14 small changes, you're gonna have some overlap on what people are working on, and then they have to deconflict that. So
For
it
sure.
occurs to me that getting that process down is going to be critical to increasing that velocity and shortening time to value and increasing the quality of those releases.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, so we get an interesting one in here as well. Ricardo's asking something in the Q&A in terms of resource allocation. Do we know how much reduction we can expect using Flowsum? So maybe an org using 4 to 5 people dedicated to Salesforce DevOps. That's kind of our sweet spot, isn't it, Don? We see a lot of those types of organizations. If you have 4 or 5 people focusing on Salesforce DevOps, we think there's room for you and for many others in this pool because it's a big and warm pool.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. In terms of resource allocation, I mean, I think when we're talking reduction, it does truly come down to each business a little bit. But we have seen with other systems where you don't have a system where your admins, your citizen developers, your developers can all play nicely in the same pool. We have seen other systems due to onboarding, due to expertise, et cetera. They've had to retain, kind of per between 8 and 10, they have to maintain one person just to maintain that system. So there's a 10 to 15% cost, an overhead cost that's not focused on productivity for other types of systems that maybe require a little more technical input. Whereas I think with a system like Flowsum, you tend to avoid that. So yeah, I think in terms of resource allocation, you can see some savings. That is a number we have seen pretty consistently with customers that we have surveyed and asked about previously. So um, productivity in that is not included in that at all, by the way. So that's just focused on upkeep and maintenance of a system that requires um, that type of resource to maintain.
Yeah, it makes sense to me too, because I run into these all the time when I first meet new companies doing Salesforce. And I really do think that it depends on why you have those 4 to 5 people. Are those 4 to 5 people strictly stuck doing keeping spreadsheets of what changes are going through, doing auditing work? Are they really focused on the nuts and bolts of what a good DevOps tool can do? And is there an opportunity to free their time up to do more productive things, do more throughput, and get, I mean, this is a revenue impacting system with Salesforce. So, you put a new feature in, there's probably a high ROI upside to it. So Don, you kind of focused on the basic blocking and tackling, which I think there's ample room there. And like you said, maybe 10%, maybe more. But when we start getting to the revenue upside, my experience, Ricardo, is that it's much, much higher potential than that. It just depends on what those 4 or 5 folks are focused on, right? Salesforce people are valuable, and people who know Salesforce DevOps are even more valuable. And so let's make sure that we're keeping them as automated and as happy as can be. And let's frankly bring your developers into it. Developers are a key constituency and audience for this. But fantastic question. We really do appreciate that one. Now, I do want to ask the webinar gods. We are a little bit over time here. We're happy to go on if there are more questions, but you're also welcome to contact us at hello@flowsum.com, or we do have a quick book a meeting link there at Flowsum as well. We do appreciate all of you for spending your time with us today, and give us a shout. Let us know how you're doing. Let us know your questions about Salesforce and DevOps. Don, any closing comments from you?
Uh, Not specifically. I just like to say thanks for all your time. I hope you found this somewhat educational. Please do reach out to us. I mean, whether you're a Flowsum customer, great. Reach out to your CSM. We'd love to have this process discussion with you, this measurement discussion with you. If you're not a customer of Flowsum, reach out through the various sales channels. We'd love to talk to you about what your challenges are and how we can help you solve those.
Yeah, thank you, Don. And thank you to all of you for spending time with us. And for those of you who answered the survey, that's awesome. There's a quick other survey coming up here on your polls and quizzes. So give us an answer there, and don't hesitate to reach out and keep us up to date on what you're doing. Thank you, everyone.